Welcome to the CSAE Research Podcasts, a series of conversations about research taking place at the Center for the Study of African Economies at the University of Oxford. I'm Banu Demir Pakel. I'm an associate professor of economics in the Department of Economics of Oxford and a member of the CSAE. Today, we'll be discussing the paper O-Ring Production Network, which was published in the Journal of Political Economy earlier this year. I'm very pleased to be joined by my co-authors, Cecilia Fieler from Yale, Daniel Zhu from Duke, and Kaili Yang from Indiana University. Before starting the conversation, let me do a spoiler alert and get to the research question we ask in the paper. So here we dive into a long-standing question, which is, what is the role of international trade in economic development, particularly in lower-income countries? Okay, Cecilia, could you explain the motivation behind this research question as well as the mechanism highlighted in the paper?
Yes, my pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here. So, as you just mentioned, it's a really broad question that motivates us. The vast majority of countries implement some form of export promotion, but what we observe is a vastly heterogeneous outcomes. So in some countries, it really doesn't seem to have much of an effect, whereas in East Asia, if you look at their development over the years, it seems to have catalyzed the broad changes in manufacturing. So manufacturing grew. Think about the East Asian tigers, South Korea, Taiwan, and then China more recently. Manufacturing grew. It improved and grew into producing more sophisticated, higher quality products. Its workforce similarly became more skilled, and that had a very broad effect on the domestic market. And what's puzzling about it is that even in these countries, but in virtually all countries that the researchers have looked at, exporters are a relatively small share of manufacturing firms, a more tradable sector. So, for example, in Turkey, where we'll look at the data, exporters account for 20% of manufacturing firms, but our mechanism that's going to go through production networks, these firms are extremely large players. They're in at least one side of the trade and manufacturing inputs in 78% of the transactions. And if you weigh these transactions by value, the exporters are in one side of 91% of trade and inputs. So our mechanism is precisely that the positive effects that exports have, and exports to rich countries in particular, and have on these exporting firms are passed through the production chain. So to understand the mechanism better, let's take the specific example of an auto parts producer that sells both to Germany, say Mercedes, a very high quality firm, and to Russian Lada. If it experiences a higher demand from Germany, from Mercedes, then it's likely to undergo several changes. For example, Germany tends to demand the higher quality products for which the firm may want to implement more modern machines that produce with higher precision and higher quality. These machines also tend to produce in small batches, making the firm more amenable to adapting to supply and demand shocks. Another demand aspect of the demand from a high quality Mercedes firm. And so the firm is also likely to adopt the just-in-time inventories. It now needs to show up at the right time, deliver the right good with the right specifications, and be able to change those specifications on the call, which typically calls for a better improvement in communications and broad improvements in management. And all these changes, they require more skilled workers. So what you observe so far, that what I've described is that when a firm experiences a higher demand from a rich country, Mercedes in our example, then it's likely to experience very broad improvements in management, technologies, logistics management, And the same is not true if it, say, experiences an increase in demand from another. But as a firm improves through the same mechanism, it's also going to demand from its suppliers that they deliver higher quality, that they deliver that flexibility to adapt to demand and supply shocks. So the firm, in a sense, passes through that shock. The shock propagates to the domestic market. To summarize, the positive effects of trading with a rich country that exporting firms experienced may potentially propagate to the domestic market through production chains. And the question that we are after, when does it occur? When does exporting propagate to create these broad effects on the market? So why don't I turn to Banu now, and she can tell us how we look at the data to see if the macro foundations of that element of demand for skills improvements at the firm level show up in the data.
Sure. So the examples you gave are amazing, but unfortunately, we can't just pick few examples from business case studies or so on. So we had this. Our challenge when we started this project was to come up with a more structured way of looking at the data to be able to identify these challenges. So to provide empirical evidence for the motivation Cecilia explained just now, we relied on some fascinating micro-level data from Turkey. So the data includes a wide range of information about Turkish firms, from their domestic firm-to-firm trade transactions and international trade transactions to balance sheets, income statements, and even details on their workers' wages and occupations, which happens to be an important piece of information for our purposes. So using this rich micro-level administrative data set, so one interesting pattern we observed was what is known as positive assortative matching on wages. What does it mean? It simply means that high-wage firms tend to trade more intensively with other high-wage firms in the data. And as you might expect, this leads to a clustering of firms that pay higher wages. In the paper, we use average firm level wages as an indicator of their output quality. And the existing literature further tells us that high-income countries tend to demand higher quality products. Building on this idea, as well as the positive assortative matching on wages that we observe in the data, we show that when demand for a firm's exports increases from wealthier countries, there's a positive effect on its average wages. And interestingly, not only does the exporting firm's average wage rises, but so do the average wages of its buyers and suppliers in the domestic market. And this empirical pattern simply sheds light on how international trade and exporting to richer countries in particular can create this ripple effect that benefits business partners of exporting firms domestically in developing countries. And maybe this is a good time for Kaili to explain to us the empirical findings in more detail and how they relate to our theoretical predictions that lead us to the counterfactual exercises we do in the paper.
Sure, I'm happy to. So Banu just gave a great discussion of our empirical results. Let me begin with quickly highlighting two of our empirical facts that we documented. So the first empirical facts is the positive assortative matching of skills in the production network. So here we use wage as a proxy for skill intensity. What we find is that high-wage firms, they disproportionately trade more with other high-wage firms. And both the extensive margin, where they match more or trade more with each other, and also the intensive margin, where given the matches, they also spend more on each other. So these two margins are both important in explaining the sorting patterns we document in the data. And for the second empirical results, we move from cross-sectional to over time variation or pattern. Here we use a shift share regression design to look at firms' responses to increase in the demand of their exports. and particularly the increase coming from rich countries. So what we find is that this kind of quality-based demand shock not only increased firms' own wages, but also the wages of their suppliers and customers. And part of that increase is driven by firms hiring new workers and also forming new business connections that have high wages compared to before. So motivated by these empirical findings, we then develop a quantitative model of heterogeneous firms. So Cecilia has done a wonderful illustration of the main mechanisms in our model in the beginning. So here I'll just briefly summarize two key ingredients of our model and then talk about the implications from our estimation. So first of all, in our model, each manufacturing firm are going to endogenously choose its own quality. So this quality choice not only going to determine the quality of its own output, but more importantly, it could also affect the marginal product of high quality inputs. Or in other words, we're going to allow the productivity or the value of high quality inputs to also depend on the purchasing firm's own quality or output quality. So this is the complementarity in production in our model, and that's going to govern the intensive margin of assorted matching we saw earlier. And the second ingredient is that each manufacturing in our model are going to also endogenously choose their suppliers and customers in a search and matching framework. So here we can think of firms, they need to post advertisement, exert search effort to find trading partners. So how these search efforts are distributed among buyers and sellers of different quality levels are going to affect the second complementarity in our model, complementarity in matching, and that's going to govern on the extensive margin of sorted matching. So our model in general are able to match the important data moments fairly well, including the two empirical facts we just talked about, assorted matching in wages, and also the shift share response to export demand shocks. But we are also able to match fairly well the joint distribution of firm wages, sizes, number of suppliers and customers, etc. So now let me talk about the important implications from our estimated model. So the first one, what we find is that the firm's search effort is directed more towards trading partners in similar quality segment to their own. We do see the complementarity in matching. The other more interesting one is our parameter estimate suggests that there's strong complementarity between input quality and output quality in production. So this feature of quality complementarity in input and output will make the quality choices of firms all interrelated. And this interconnection in firms' quality choices will be very important in understanding some of the interesting results we find in the counterfactual analyses. So now I'll pass along to Daniel to tell us more there.
All right. Yeah, thanks a lot, Kaili, for really setting this great stage for me and emphasizing this kind of interconnectedness of the firm's upgrading decisions. So now I'm going to use this as an opportunity to talk about, maybe just like circling back to the initial question that posed by Cecilia, right? So in thinking about these promotion policies being so prevalent across different countries and why we see a big response in some of the countries while we don't see that in some of the other countries. Before I go there, let me first emphasize that to have an equivalent model, in terms of thinking about the interconnected of the firm, is going to be a crucial ingredient to understand the answer to these questions, right? So general equivalence is very important here because, while our empirical identification relies very heavily on this idea that firms going to respond differently to idiosyncratic export demand shocks, our model is going to be thinking about the hypothetical scenario that there's a broad range of firms who are going to be all being kind of experiencing certain type of export demand shocks, very likely coming from these government's export promotion effort, right? So and then within this equilibrium, we're going to maintain the magnitude of these export promotion demand shocks to be very comparable to those idiosyncratic shocks we have seen currently in the data, just to make the scenario more realistic. Imagine that government would actually try to subsidize the matching effort by running trade fairs, by helping to match up with foreign business partners, by subsidizing these efforts by around like 9%. Okay, and that will be generating a common export shock, demand shock of like around 5%, very similar to what we have seen in the idiosyncratic demand experienced in our empirical study. what's going to happen to this overall economy in that scenario, okay? And our model going to predict that there'll be broad range of changes, start with the exporters themselves, not surprisingly, because they are now being matched to more customers, particularly from high-income economies, they will have more motivation to increase their own quality, right, and hiring more skilled workers. But the reaction doesn't really stop there, and then the two pieces of the model forces that Kaili emphasized now going to enter here. The first thing is that these firms now going to increasingly use more high quality inputs, right, coming from the domestic suppliers, right, and then that in turn is going to promote the adoption of high quality decisions by the domestic suppliers too, and the domestic supplier is going to respond to that, right? And the second force is that they are going to be increasingly targeting their search towards the segment of the domestic economy which is able to provide high quality inputs too. And then meanwhile, the domestic supplier realizing that's happening, they will also adjust their effort accordingly, right? So that's going to trigger a very broad range of changes in the domestic manufacturing economy. So our model going to predict that because of those forces together, as a whole, there'll be a lot of upgrading happening, not only limited to these exporters, but also happening to the domestic firms. And as a whole, we'll see a pretty significant increase of the domestic worker wages by around like 1.2%. And thinking about the magnitude, this will be almost like 8 to 9 times larger than compared with another more standard model where we still have domestic import connections, but we don't have these kind of endogenous search effort embedded in there. Neither do we have the assortative matching of the quality of the input-output channel in there. Then the reaction will be much muted, compared with our model will be illustrating. Okay, then you think about, okay, that's such a rosy picture, right? That sounds like a East Asian economy that Cecilia has just motivated. But why it doesn't happen everywhere? Okay, and for the rest of the paper, we put in a lot of caveats to argue that a lot of the domestic conditions could affect the strength of that response. For one thing, you can think about, very naturally, this kind of broad scale of changes will need more skilled workers, right? So depends on the education level and the initial condition of the local labor market and in those countries, and what is the supply elasticity of the skilled labor going to determine, the strength of this channel by a lot, right? So if you think about initially when Cecilia motivated thinking about East Asian economy, a lot of them have like a kind of a rich stock of human capital already embedded in these economies. And because of these kind of abundance of the supply of the skilled workers, which already exist in those economies, they just allow them to facilitate these kind of changes a lot easier. Okay. Well, when you look at some other country, maybe that condition just doesn't hold. Okay. Another thing we tend to observe in some of the East Asian economy is that very often they would run a trade surplus for an extended amount of time. The government will be thinking about exchange rate policies that allow these export expansion to run an extended period of time. While when we think about some other economy, maybe the trade rebalancing happening really quickly. And then the exchange rate appreciation gonna really putting a brake on a lot of the export expansion experienced by these firms and backed out a lot of the initial changes that we tend to see, right? So in general, for the rest of the paper, we really highlighted that to achieve these kind of broad level of technological upgrading that our model has generated, there are a lot of additional necessary conditions. Some of them might hold in some countries, but some of them might not, right? So to assess the success of the policy and to design the policy, really we need to think about the whole package, but not the export promotions policy by itself in isolation. Okay, so I think I will close the general kind of the prediction based on our paper here and get this back to Banu.
So, Daniel, so it looks like it's not pre-lunch. So there's some initial conditions as well as other policies that need to complement these type of export promotion policies in order for these countries to benefit, as predicted by our model. But do you think it's only export promotion policies, or our results can also provide some insights into other type of policies that are being discussed in policy circles right now?
Yeah, I think our paper actually provides more generalizable insights, because when you think about at the deep level, what the export promotion policy has been doing in our paper is really to think about a facilitate kind of like coordination device, right? Thinking about something that's going to facilitate upgrading by the firms embedded in a production network, and one going to affecting the other. Right. And that actually has a strong flavor, to think about any other policy that generally we consider industrial policy, right? Any other policy that rely on these kind of big push type of ideas, and try to think about, the linkages within the domestic economy. They all having these kind of similar features, right? One example is to think about the green transition of the firms, right? So maybe some of the cleaner firms, they have to rely on the cleaner inputs to actually achieve that, right? And then that make all these firms decision to invest in green technology all kind of connected to each other. But meanwhile, we can also think about, there are certain constraints on these kind of responses because, the provision of those clean energies, right? The price might respond very strongly, coming from the supply side too, So to some extent, a lot of the forces we have emphasized in our current model could bring to other policy proposals we've been considering in the current age, in particular when we see kind of like a revival of the discussion about the industrial policies and thinking about green industrial policies. I think a lot of things we have emphasized here could also be shedding light on the design of those kind of like so-called new industrial policies.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah, I'm glad that Daniel mentioned these things, because one thing that comes out very clearly in our model is that if exports to rich countries are what's going to act as a catalyzer to these broad improvements in manufacturing, then running export surpluses with rich countries works. Right? And it was the experience of East Asia, but we can't prescribe that as a future policy. For one, rich countries are closing themselves more and more. And in addition, not all countries can simultaneously run these large surpluses with rich countries. But the broader point is that having positive effects on few large players in the domestic market is likely to propagate through production chains and have a much wider effect on the market than the narrow measured effect on that firm itself.
Exactly. And when it comes to green transition, firms, green transition, so people are talking about this tipping point, right? So as more and more firms do it, so it's going to lower the cost, and that's exactly one of the mechanisms that we show in the paper. So upgrading to higher quality production, the cost of doing so will get smaller as more and more firms actually do it. And that is speaking very much to this tipping point discussion in green transition. Okay, so thank you, Cecilia, Daniel, and Kaili, for this interesting discussion. And it was amazing to revisit our joint research journey with you. And thanks to everyone for listening to this CSAE Research Podcast. And we hope you will join us again next time. And if you want to listen to more episodes from the series, please go to the CSAE website.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.